Have you ever woken up at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, feeling a heavy, unexplainable void settling deep into your chest? You have done everything the system asked of you. You worked the decades-long corporate grind. You provided for your family. You sat in those padded megachurch pews every Sunday, listening to the same sanitized sermons, reciting the same memorized prayers, waiting for a divine breakthrough that never seemed to arrive. And in the quiet, suffocating darkness of the night, a terrifying whisper echoes in your mind. Is this all there is? Why do my prayers feel like they are bouncing off a concrete ceiling? Am I just flawed? Listen closely to me. You are not broken. You never were. The absolute exhaustion you feel right now is not a medical condition. It is spiritual amnesia. And it is the holy dissatisfaction of a sovereign soul that has outgrown the narrow, suffocating cage of institutional religion. The reason you feel like a misfit, the reason you feel an ache for something deeper, is because you carry an ancient frequency. A divine spark that the empire has spent 2,000 years trying to extinguish. They handed you a matrix of control. A religion built on guilt, passive waiting, and begging a distant God in the sky for a rescue mission. And to keep you trapped in that matrix, the early religious architects had to erase the most empowering, dangerous chapter of human history. They had to hide the blueprint of your own liberation. They had to bury the 18 lost years of the Master. Think about the sheer mathematical impossibility of the story they sold you in Sunday school. And the canonical Gospels give us a brief glimpse of a 12-year-old boy, brilliant and radiant, astonishing the elite theologians in the Temple of Jerusalem. Then, the curtain drops. A deafening silence falls over the text, a complete, unexplainable void. 18 years pass without a single word. When the curtain finally rises again at the Jordan River, a 30-year-old man emerges. But he is no longer just a brilliant boy. He is an absolute master of reality. He commands the elements. He heals the sick with a word. He teaches profound, mystical concepts of inner light, universal love, and the kingdom within. Concepts that scholars know go far beyond the strict, legalistic traditions of first-century Judea. The institutional church expects you to believe a comfortable, harmless lie. They tell you that for those 18 crucial years, the most important figure in human history was simply sweeping sawdust in a quiet carpenter shop in Nazareth. They want you to believe he was just building wooden tables and waiting for a magical clock to strike. But ask yourself this: does building wooden chairs teach a man how to transfigure human consciousness? Does hiding in a quiet village equip a man to deliver a universal spiritual technology that would threaten the absolute power of the Roman Empire? They gave you the carpenter because a carpenter is safe. A carpenter does not challenge the empire. But the truth is not safe. The truth is revolutionary. The answer to this 18-year silence does not come from modern speculation. It does not come from theological guesswork. It comes from a discovery so profound, so irrefutable, that it threatens to dismantle the entire religious industrial complex overnight. Deep within the subterranean, highly classified archives of the National Library in Iran, protected within a sealed bronze cylinder and wrapped in ancient Persian silk, a document has survived the fires of history. Authenticated by international specialists, carbon dated by independent laboratories in Switzerland, France, and the United States. Written just 50 years after Christ, this is the Persian Codex of Eastern testimonies. These are not myths. These are the meticulously documented, first-hand accounts written by people who looked him in the eyes, people who walked with him, people who witnessed his radical transformation not in the quiet hills of Galilee, but in the blazing, esoteric epicenters of the ancient East. No wonder the translation of this Aramaic and Persian manuscript reveals a truth so staggering you will never be able to read your Bible the exact same way again. When Jesus reached the age of 13, he did not pick up a hammer. He did not settle into a life of quiet anonymity. He embarked on an extraordinary, rigorous initiation, a massive pilgrimage across the most dangerous trade routes of the ancient world. He was stepping into a crucible that would forge him into the ultimate bearer of divine light. But here is where the story gets deeply personal for you. The Seeker. This journey was not spontaneous. It was not a teenage rebellion. It was the activation of a cosmic code, a sacred covenant made decades earlier by the most misunderstood men in biblical history. If he was not shaping wood for 18 years, what was he shaping? And what forbidden spiritual technologies was he mastering in the lands of the rising sun? Technologies so powerful that Rome would rather execute him and rewrite history than let you discover them. The answer to unlocking your own dormant power begins not in Nazareth, but under a strange star, with a promise that changed the frequency of the earth. Picture the scene you have been shown every December since you were a child. The quiet little manger, the gentle shepherds, the bright star hovering peacefully in the night sky. And there, standing politely in the corner, are 3 kings in colorful robes holding small wooden boxes. It is a beautiful, comforting picture, but it is a sanitized fairy tale, a carefully constructed illusion designed by the religious empire to hide the most explosive spiritual alliance in human history. But if you want to understand the true magnitude of your own spiritual sovereignty, you have to unlearn the bedtime stories. The men who arrived in Bethlehem that night were not kings, and according to the Persian Codex of Eastern Testimonies, they were not 3. There were 12 of them. They were the Supreme Council of the Magi, the highest-ranking Zoroastrian priests of the mighty Persian Empire. These were not casual stargazers or wandering mystics. They were the absolute masters of ancient esoteric science, sacred mathematics, and celestial alchemy. They were the kingmakers of the ancient East. Men so powerful and deeply connected to the divine frequency that even the ruthless Roman Empire feared their influence. Ask yourself a logical question. Why would the most powerful spiritual leaders of a rival empire cross a brutal, hostile desert simply to drop off a few jars of spices to a peasant child and then vanish forever? It makes absolutely no sense. But the matrix of religion relies on you never asking that question. They need you to believe it was just a random, unexplained miracle. They need to keep the narrative small, so that your understanding of your own divine potential remains small. The Iranian manuscript shatters this illusion completely. The Magi did not cross the desert on a whim. They were executing a cosmic blueprint. They were tracking a 500-year-old prophecy that had been guarded with their very lives. Deep within the Avesta, the sacred texts of their ancient tradition, a great reformer named Zarathustra had seen a vision of the end of the age of separation. He prophesied the arrival of the Saoshyant, the universal light-bearer, a child born in the Western lands who would not belong to a single tribe, a single bloodline, or a single religion. This child would be the living synthesis, the one who would unite all the authentic traditions of light on earth before the final confrontation between good and evil. These Persian priests had been running the celestial calculations for 20 generations. When the frequency of the heavens shifted and the cosmic alignment occurred, they knew the divine spark had finally incarnated in physical form. They did not come to merely worship a baby. They came to initiate a master. Think about your own life for a moment, beloved seeker. Think about how long you have been waiting for your own breakthrough. Wonder how many years you have spent feeling like a misfit, carrying a deep inner knowing that you were meant for something massive, but feeling completely ignored by the traditional systems around you. The Magi understood that feeling of waiting, but they also knew that divine timing is absolute. When the moment arrives, the universe moves mountains to connect the chosen ones with their destiny. The manuscript preserves the actual documented conversation between Hormizd the seer, the visionary leader of the Magi, and Joseph, the earthly father. Hormizd looked at the humble, exhausted carpenter and said, "We do not come as strangers, but as brothers in hope. This child is the fulfillment of prophecies our masters have guarded for 20 generations. But for him to fulfill his destiny, he must know all the traditions of light that the Creator has revealed to the peoples of the earth. Listen closely to what happened next, because this is the exact secret that Rome spent centuries trying to erase from your memory. When the Magi opened their treasures, they did not just offer physical gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Those material items were just the royal cover for the real gift. They brought a portable archive, a heavily guarded library of Persian sacred texts and esoteric scrolls containing the deepest spiritual technologies of the Eastern world. They left these scrolls of fire in the custody of Joseph and Mary with strict, unwavering instructions. The boy was to study them the moment he was old enough to comprehend the mysteries. Let that sink in. The suppressed wisdom of the East was placed directly into his hands from the very beginning. This is the master key. The institutional church deliberately hid from you. This is exactly why a 12-year-old boy could walk into the massive temple of Jerusalem and completely dismantle the arguments of the elite religious scholars. He was not just quoting their own rigid laws back to them. He was operating on an entirely different frequency. He was already integrating the universal cosmic codes left to him by the Magi. He possessed a level of holistic spiritual intelligence that absolutely terrified the religious gatekeepers of his day. But the giving of the ancient scrolls was only the first phase of the plan. The Iranian Codex reveals that before the 12 Persian priests faded back into the dark desert night, they established a sacred covenant with the family, a binding spiritual contract between the ancient wisdom of the East and the newborn light of the West. Hormizd the seer looked deep into Joseph's eyes and delivered a mandate that would forever alter the course of human consciousness. He declared that when the boy reached the age of spiritual responsibility, the High Council would return. They would send their greatest master teachers to bring him back across the sands to the lands of the rising sun, to complete his ultimate initiation. It was not a goodbye. It was a ticking clock. A countdown had begun in the unseen realm. The sacred covenant was sealed, and the celestial machinery was irreversibly set in motion. For exactly 13 years, the boy would grow in absolute secret, absorbing the forbidden scrolls, expanding his consciousness, rigorously preparing his physical vessel for the ultimate crucible. The matrix of religion desperately wants you to believe his story just went quiet. They want you to think he was just doing ordinary chores. But the silence was actually a highly calibrated divine preparation. And when that clock finally struck 0, the eastern sky would crack open once again. Have you ever felt the agonizing, suffocating weight of divine timing? You know exactly what I'm talking about. That deep, aching sensation in the absolute center of your chest, when you know you carry a massive purpose. But your current reality looks incredibly small. You wake up every single day in the same house. You drive the same exhausting commute. You sit in the same church pews that feel more like sterile waiting rooms than actual sanctuaries. You look around at your life, at the endless bills, the broken relationships, the physical fatigue settling into your bones, and you think I was made for something greater than this mundane routine? I am a library wearing skin. Why am I stuck here? But the door remains locked. The silence from heaven feels absolute. You feel like a sovereign soul trapped in a permanent holding pattern, wondering if you missed your window, wondering if your destiny was somehow derailed by your past mistakes. Listen closely to me, beloved. You are not stuck. You are incubating. The waiting season is never a punishment. It is the sacred forge where the universe builds the emotional and spiritual muscle you will need to carry the massive weight of your actual calling. Do not ever mistake your current isolation for abandonment. The greatest spiritual masters in human history did not bypass the waiting room. They mastered it. Think about the young master living in the dusty, overlooked village of Nazareth. The institutional religious complex paints this picture of a passive, submissive boy quietly sweeping sawdust, doing chores, and waiting for God to magically drop a universal ministry into his lap. They want you to believe he was just an ordinary peasant passing the time until his 30th birthday, perfectly content with a small provincial life. Why? Because a humble, quiet carpenter is safe. A carpenter does not challenge the empire. A carpenter does not threaten the religious hierarchy. By keeping his early story small, they intentionally keep your understanding of your own divine potential small. But the Persian Codex of Eastern Testimonies completely shatters that matrix illusion. He was not just waiting, he was being actively, rigorously monitored. The sacred covenant forged in Bethlehem by the high-ranking Zoroastrian priests was a living, breathing spiritual contract. And they never took their eyes off their investment. The ancient manuscript reveals that during his childhood, the Persian masters made secret periodic visits to Nazareth to assess his spiritual evolution. They were tracking the expansion of his consciousness. Imagine this cinematic scene. In the quiet, heavy shadows of a Galilean evening, far away from the prying eyes and rigid rules of the local religious leaders, an 8-year-old boy sits across from a towering Persian sage named Miha Narsi. This was not a friendly social visit. It was a rigorous spiritual audit. The sage looked deep into the eyes of the boy and posed a question designed to test the very limits of ancient theology. He asked, if the Creator is absolute pure light, where does darkness come from? In traditional Western religion, darkness is personified. It is treated as an equal opposing force to God, a terrifying enemy that must be constantly feared, fought, and begged away. This dualistic fear is the exact mechanism the Church uses to keep you terrified of demonic attacks and entirely reliant on their institutional protection. But the 8-year-old master, operating on a frequency of pure Christ consciousness, looked back at the ancient sage and delivered a paradigm-shattering truth. He said darkness is not a thing that comes from somewhere. It is simply the absence of light. When light arrives, darkness disappears without fighting. Let that sink in for a moment. Pause here with me and take a breath. Think about that profound, ancient spiritual technology. You do not have to fight the shadows in your life. You do not have to wrestle with the depression, the financial panic, or the generational trauma as if they are invincible monsters. You simply have to turn on the light. You have to activate the divine spark within your own living temple, and the darkness has no choice but to instantly dissolve. It does not fight you. It vanishes. When the Persian sage heard this brilliant response, he marveled and declared, "Truly wisdom speaks through this child's mouth." He knew the boy was ready. The vessel was prepared. Time moved forward. The preparation continued in absolute secret. And the boy integrated the hidden scrolls left by the Magi, while outwardly navigating the mundane physical world of his family. He walked the same dusty streets you walk. He felt the same human frustrations you feel. Until the clock of the sacred covenant finally struck 0. According to the Iranian manuscript, it happened in his 13th year. In Jewish tradition, this is the age of the bar mitzvah, the exact moment a boy crosses the threshold into spiritual maturity and responsibility. It was not a random Tuesday. It was a highly calibrated cosmic appointment. Imagine the scene erupting on the quiet streets of Nazareth. The rumble of a massive caravan. A group of wealthy, imposing Persian merchants arrives in the impoverished village. They are wearing intricate silks and carrying the undeniable authority of an empire thousands of miles away. The local villagers and synagogue leaders stare in absolute shock and suspicion. But Joseph and Mary do not show a single trace of surprise. The manuscript is incredibly clear on this historical detail. This was not a kidnapping. This was not a forced exile or a frantic escape. It was the flawless execution of the promise made by the Magi 13 years prior in a dimly lit room in Bethlehem. The merchants carried a specific unyielding message for the family. The time has come. The child is ready to receive the complete wisdom of the ancient world. If this profound hidden history is confirming something deep inside your spirit today, do not let this moment pass. That resonance you feel right now in your chest is the sound of your own soul remembering the truth. I invite you to make a public declaration of your awakening. Subscribe to The Chosen One's Destiny and join the hidden remnant who refuse to stay asleep in the matrix of modern religion. Drop a comment below with just 3 words, "I am ready." Let the algorithm and the unseen realm know that you are finally stepping into your true sovereign power. The young master packed his few earthly belongings. He looked back one final time at the small, restricted world of his childhood. He knew he could not fulfill a universal destiny while remaining in a provincial cage. And neither can you, beloved. Sometimes leaving behind the familiar traditions and comforting limitations of your past is the exact requirement to activate the massive future you were built for. As he turned his back on Nazareth and stepped onto the ancient trade routes heading east, he was not just taking a journey, but he was walking straight into a spiritual crucible that would permanently alter the frequency of the entire earth. Imagine leaving everything you have ever known. The familiar dust of the Judean desert yielding to the staggering, magnificent magnitude of Ctesiphon, the crown jewel of the Persian Empire. This was not a world of simple fishermen and quiet provincial carpenters. This was the absolute epicenter of global esoteric knowledge. Massive stone ziggurats piercing the heavens. Lush hanging gardens blooming under the brilliant canopy of the Milky Way. Grand altars holding eternal fires that had not been extinguished for centuries. When the young master arrived at the gates of this ancient metropolis, he was not a wide-eyed tourist lost in a foreign land. He was the living, breathing fulfillment of their most guarded prophecies. He was stepping onto the stage he was born to command. For the modern seeker listening to my voice right now, I want you to feel the profound weight of this moment. Think about your own journey. How many times have you been told by a pastor or a religious institution that God only exists inside the 4 walls of their specific building? How many times were you warned that studying other philosophies, looking deeply into the mysteries of the universe, or exploring the ancient traditions of the East would somehow lead you straight into darkness? The matrix of modern religion relies entirely on keeping your worldview incredibly small. They build invisible fear-based fences around your mind. They teach you to be terrified of the unknown. But the supreme consciousness that walked the earth 2,000 years ago refused to be fenced in by human dogma. Upon entering the grand courtyards of the Zoroastrian fire temples, Jesus did not condemn them. He did not act like an arrogant religious missionary trying to convert the ignorant pagans. According to the meticulously translated Iranian Codex, he looked at the massive towers of fire and the ancient sages teaching under the stars, and he turned to his companions. He spoke a sentence that would completely shatter the rigid tribalism of his day and tear down the walls of institutional exclusivity. He said, "Truly, my Father has many dwellings, and in each of them there are those who seek his face with sincerity." Let that profound truth anchor deep into your spirit right now. Let it sink in. He recognized the divine spark in a foreign land. He understood that the infinite creator of the cosmos cannot be monopolized by one denomination, one bloodline, or one rigid set of theological rules. This is exactly the kind of universal, unconditional frequency the religious industrial complex has desperately tried to hide from you for 2 millennia. They want you terrified of the outside world. They want you to believe that everyone who does not pray exactly like you is disconnected from Source. But the Master embraced the truth wherever it radiated light. He saw the divine signature in everything. During his years in Ctesiphon, then the young Nazarene was plunged into an intensive, rigorous immersion of sacred sciences. The Persian priests were not just theologians. When they were the undisputed masters of astronomy, sacred mathematics, and celestial mechanics. They understood that the universe is not random chaos. It is a highly calibrated spiritual technology. They taught him the intricate cycles of the planets, the geometric codes of creation, and the precise ways that celestial movements reflect universal spiritual patterns. But here is where the historical record becomes absolutely electrifying. Here is where the rebel sage emerges. He did not just blindly absorb their ancient wisdom. He elevated it. He rewrote the cosmic code. On one documented occasion, the highest-ranking masters of the empire were explaining how to calculate planetary cycles to determine the exact propitious times for different spiritual activities. They believed human destiny was tied to the stars. They were bound by the math and bound by the sky. Jesus listened patiently to his teachers, and then he responded with a frequency of pure sovereign power that stunned the greatest minds of the East. He looked at them and said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, but he is not limited by his own creations. Whoever lives in harmony with the Creator is in harmony with all creation without need for calculations." Pause and breathe that in. Think about that for a moment. He was telling the most advanced astrologers of the ancient world that the human soul is vastly superior to the stars. You are not a victim of celestial mechanics. You are not bound by fate or destiny or the mathematical cycles of the matrix. When you align your internal frequency with the Supreme Creator, you bypass the system entirely. You step outside the illusion of control. So you become the absolute master of your reality. You become a walking activation code. The Persian scholars were so shaken by this supreme revelation that they immediately stopped lecturing him and began consulting this teenage boy about the interpretations of their own sacred texts. He was dismantling the illusion of separation layer by layer. He was synthesizing the deepest esoteric truths of the East with the prophetic destiny of the West. He was proving that the kingdom of heaven is an internal sovereign reality accessible to anyone who chooses light over darkness. He was showing them that the divine blueprint is not written in the stars above. It is encoded directly into the DNA of the human vessel. But absolute mastery is never handed over without a crucible. And the Supreme Council of the Magi recognized the unparalleled brilliance of his mind. They knew he carried the ancient flame. But intellectual knowledge is never enough to break the matrix. The physical vessel must be rigorously tested. The spiritual body must be pushed to the absolute terrifying edge of human endurance. The Persian masters needed to know if he could truly anchor the eternal light into physical space. They were about to subject him to the most grueling initiation of the ancient world. A sacred trial of fire and total sensory deprivation that would strip away every remaining layer of his human limitation. A test so intense, so profoundly dangerous, it could easily cost him his earthly life. Have you ever felt like you were being pushed to your absolute breaking point? A moment in your life where the financial pressure, the emotional betrayal, or the physical exhaustion became so heavy, you thought you were going to collapse. The religious matrix tells you that this crushing pressure is a punishment. They tell you it is the enemy attacking you because you did something wrong. But they are lying to you. Listen closely to me. The greatest spiritual masters are not born in comfort. They are forged in the fire. What feels like a breaking point is actually an initiation. It is the sacred crucible designed to burn away the false identity the world gave you, so the divine spark can finally take over. The young master understood this perfectly. The Iranian manuscript reveals that during his second year in the magnificent capital of Ctesiphon, when the Supreme Council of the Magi did not just hand him their highest esoteric titles. He had to earn them. He had to prove that the cosmic codes he understood in his mind could actually be anchored into his physical flesh. He was invited to participate in the most rigorous and terrifying initiation of the ancient Persian world, the sacred fire test. This was not a written exam. It was an absolute somatic dismantling of the human ego. The ritual required the candidate to sit in deep, unbroken meditation on the cold stone floor of the main temple, directly in front of the massive eternal flame that had burned for centuries. 3 days, 3 nights. No food, no water, no sleep, just the deafening roar of the fire and the absolute isolation of the mind. Imagine the physical toll. Think about the intense heat radiating against his skin, the agonizing thirst scratching at his throat, the natural human instinct screaming at him to surrender, to give up, to walk away, and return to a comfortable, ordinary life. The medical empire of today would call this dangerous. The religious system would call it unnecessary. But the ancients knew that the human vessel must be completely emptied before it can be filled with the infinite. According to the meticulously preserved testimony of the supervising high priest recorded in the ancient parchment, the masters watched him closely from the shadows. By the night of the 3rd day, they fully expected the young Nazarene to collapse, when they expected the limits of his human biology to finally break. But then the impossible happened. In the pitch-black darkness of the final night, a shift occurred. The manuscript describes it with cinematic precision. A new frequency began to vibrate through the heavy air of the temple. The high priests leaned in their breath, catching in their throats, because the light illuminating the room was no longer coming from the massive altar of wood and oil. It was coming from him. An inexplicable, pure, luminous gold light began to physically manifest around the young master. It did not reflect off his skin. It emanated from within his very being. It radiated from the center of his chest and from the hidden eye in the center of his forehead. The divine spark had fully ignited. The Christ consciousness was entirely activated. The manuscript records that the frequency of this light was so intense, so overwhelmingly pure, that the priests fell to their knees. Within that blinding radiance, they saw ethereal, angelic forms descending and ascending around his physical body. He had opened the portal. He had proven that the true Holy of Holies is not a building made of stone. It is the human body. Let that sink in, beloved. Pause here and take a deep breath. Feel the steady rhythm of your own heart. That exact same light, that exact same divine technology is dormant inside of you right now. You are a living, breathing temple. You do not need to go to a building to find the Creator. You do not need a middleman to access the sacred fire. You are the fire. When the morning sun finally broke through the temple windows, the initiation was complete. The Supreme Council of Zoroastrian priests did not treat him as a student anymore. The high priest Kartir stepped forward trembling with profound awe and officially declared, "This young man is not just a seeker of divine mysteries. He is a master sent by the Creator himself to carry light to all nations." From that exact moment they bestowed upon him a title reserved only for the highest prophets in their millennial history. Mithra Yazad, the bearer of divine light. He had conquered the flesh. He had mastered the energetic parasite of fear and physical limitation. He had bridged the gap between the earthly and the eternal. But this was not the end of his preparation. The Persian Empire was only the first threshold. The sacred covenant demanded that he master every tradition of light on earth. As he walked out of the fire temple, his eyes turned further east, beyond the Persian deserts, toward the staggering snow-capped peaks of the highest mountains in the world. He was stepping onto the ancient Silk Road, heading into a territory where an entirely different ancient wisdom was waiting for his arrival, a tradition that would teach him the ultimate secret of human suffering. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of the 3 in the morning terror? You know the exact feeling. The house is completely silent, but your mind is roaring. The financial pressure, the health anxieties, the deep, agonizing fear that you are running out of time and your life has amounted to nothing but endless struggle. The modern world tells you this is just stress. The medical empire hands you a pill to numb your mind. The religious matrix tells you to just pray harder, accept your brokenness, and wait for a rescue boat. But they are entirely wrong. Listen closely to me, beloved. Your suffering is not a medical condition. It is a spiritual symptom. You are experiencing the ultimate human condition of attachment to a temporary world. But you were not built for the temporary. You are a sovereign soul. You were built for the eternal. The young master understood this agony perfectly. As he left the blazing fire temples of the Persian Empire, he did not head back to the familiar comforts of the West. The sacred covenant pushed him further into the unknown. He walked the treacherous high-altitude paths of the ancient trade routes, moving higher into the thin, freezing air of the eastern mountains. He was entering territories where an entirely different ancient spiritual technology had been mastered. The realms of the monks, the guardians of inner silence. When he arrived at these remote, high-altitude monasteries, he was not greeted as a stranger. Just like the Zoroastrian high priests, these Eastern monks possessed their own ancient prophecies. They had been waiting for a specific cosmic frequency to manifest on Earth. According to the Iranian manuscript, when they looked at this young Nazarene, they did not see a foreign traveler. They saw the literal embodiment of their deepest sacred texts. They gave him a name that would echo through the corridors of eternity. Bodhisattva Maitreya, the enlightened being of compassion who would come to save all conscious beings. Let that sink in for a moment. And these ancient monks who had spent their entire lives mastering the mind recognized the ultimate savior of humanity in a Jewish carpenter. The universe does not care about religious labels. The Creator operates on a frequency of pure, unconditional love that transcends every human border. The manuscript preserves an absolute masterpiece of a conversation. A dialogue between the young master and a revered monk named Sangharakita. A conversation that holds the exact master key to unlocking you from your midnight panic. The elderly monk looked at the young master and asked the ultimate question. How can the suffering of the world be eliminated? Think about how traditional religion answers this. They tell you to endure the pain because you will get a mansion in the sky after you die. They tell you suffering is the punishment for human flaws. But the Master, operating in total Christ consciousness, delivered a paradigm-shattering truth. He looked at the monk and said, "Suffering is born from attachment to the temporal and forgetfulness of the eternal. But the remedy is not to flee the world. but to transform it by bringing the eternal into time, the divine into the human. Pause here with me. Take a slow, deep breath. Let those words wash over your exhausted spirit. Suffering is born from attachment to the temporal. When you lie awake terrified of your bank account, your aging physical body, or the people who walked away from you, you are attaching your sovereign soul to things that turn to dust. You are forgetting your eternal nature. The matrix wants you obsessed with the temporary, so you remain powerless and afraid. If this ancient truth is breaking the chains of your anxiety right now, I invite you to make a sacred vow. Subscribe to The Chosen One's Destiny and join the hidden remnant who are bringing the eternal into the temporal. Like this video as a digital signal fire to let the other seekers know they are not alone. The Master gave you the ultimate activation code. The remedy is not to flee the world. You do not have to escape your life, your job, or your family to be holy. You have to transform it. You have to pull the frequency of the eternal realm directly into your Tuesday morning commute. You have to bring the divine into the human. When you walk into a stressful room, you are not just a person enduring a bad day. You are the eternal light stepping into temporary darkness. Crow, when you realize that you completely stripped the matrix of its power over your emotions. The monk Sangharakita was so overwhelmed by this supreme wisdom that he wept. He recognized that this was not just philosophy. It was a living transmission. The Master had done it. He had spent years in the East absorbing, synthesizing, and elevating the most advanced spiritual technologies of the ancient world. From the cosmic mathematics of Persia to the profound mental mastery of the high mountains. He was fully activated, the ultimate human vessel carrying the absolute fullness of the divine spark. But the time of preparation was over. The universe was calling him back. He had to take this unified supreme consciousness back to the West, back to the rigid, dogmatic, and highly controlled world of his birth. And bringing this level of spiritual sovereignty back to the West would make him the absolute most dangerous man to the Roman Empire. Imagine the dust of the desert settling as he walked back into the narrow, suffocating streets of Nazareth. He had been gone for 5 years. When he left, he was a brilliant young student. When he returned, he was the absolute master of reality. He had traversed the most rigorous spiritual crucibles on earth. He had sat in the blazing fire temples of Ctesiphon and the freezing high-altitude monasteries of the East. He had synthesized the absolute depths of human consciousness. And now, he was bringing that terrifying, magnificent power back home. The Iranian manuscript records the exact moment his family saw him again. According to the ancient testimonies, his mother Mary did not just see her son. She saw the cosmos looking back at her. She noted a wisdom in his eyes that was not there when he left. He spoke the same language, he used the same earthly words, but now every single syllable carried the heavy, undeniable resonance of deep, eternal truths. He was no longer just a Jewish carpenter. He was the living embodiment of the divine spark, the physical manifestation of the universal light. But this massive expansion of consciousness immediately collided with the rigid, fear-based matrix of the local religious system. You know exactly how this feels? Think about the moments in your own life when you started waking up. When you started questioning the dogmas of your childhood church. When you realized you were outgrowing the small theological boxes they tried to force you into. You felt the judgment of your peers. You felt the cold, suspicious stares of the gatekeepers who demanded you fall back in line. When the Master walked into the synagogue in Capernaum, the religious leaders instantly sensed a massive threat to their authority. They were obsessed with rules, rituals, and exclusionary laws. They cornered him and demanded to know where he had learned his radical interpretations of Scripture. They wanted to know what authorized him to speak with such sovereign power? His response, recorded in the Persian Codex, completely shattered their exclusionary matrix. He looked directly at the religious gatekeepers and said, "My heavenly Father has many dwellings and has revealed his truth to many peoples. What I have learned does not contradict our Father's scriptures, but illuminates them with the light the same Spirit has given to other children of his." Suarez, pause here with me. Let that sink in. He was validating the universal truth of the Creator. He was telling them that God cannot be monopolized by one tribe, one building, or one set of man-made rules. This idea was absolute theological treason to the religious elite. But to the hungry, spiritually exhausted seekers of his day, it was the ultimate liberation. To bypass the rigid watchdogs of the institutional church, the Master deployed the most advanced Eastern pedagogy he had acquired. He wrapped cosmic, mind-bending spiritual technologies in simple, everyday stories about seeds, trees, and harvests. You know them as parables. But the Sunday school system stripped them of their power. They taught you these were just nice moral stories for children. They lied to you, or these parables were esoteric activation codes designed to bypass the logical mind and plant eternal truths directly into the subconscious. The manuscript reveals that his famous teachings were direct integrations of Persian and Buddhist wisdom. He taught the students of the Fire Temple that the kingdom of heaven is like a tiny mustard seed that grows into a massive tree. But he went deeper. He took a pomegranate, split it open, and showed the countless seeds hidden inside the thick skin. He looked at his followers and delivered a masterclass in spiritual sovereignty. He said in each seed is contained the complete tree with all its future fruits. In each soul is contained the complete kingdom of God with all its glory. Think about that. He was not telling them to wait for a distant heaven after they died. He was telling them that the entire divine blueprint, the absolute fullness of the Creator, is fully downloaded and dormant inside your physical body right now. You are not a miserable creature begging for scraps from the Master's table. You are a king in exile. You carry the entire universe in your chest. And this brings us to the most dangerous weapon he gave humanity: the ultimate rebellion against the religious matrix. The way you were taught to pray is a deliberate deception. The institutional church conditioned you to bow your head, close your eyes, and beg a distant, angry God for mercy. They turned prayer into a transaction of guilt. They taught you to approach the Creator as a flawed, unworthy subject. But the Master brought back an ancient technology of direct somatic connection. The original Lord's Prayer was not a plea. It was an alignment. He taught his followers to stand sovereign, to use the frequency of their own breath, and to declare an inclusive, universal activation. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name in all languages and among all peoples. Thy kingdom come not only to Israel, but to all the earth. He was removing the middleman completely. He was telling the exhausted masses that they did not need the temple priests. They did not need the blood sacrifices. They did not need to buy their way into divine favor. They simply needed to tune their internal frequency to the vibration of unconditional love. The religious leaders were absolutely furious. He was dismantling their entire economic and political power structure by giving the spiritual power directly back to the people. They called him a heretic. They plotted in the shadows to destroy him. But the anger of the local priests was nothing compared to the absolute apocalyptic panic erupting in the halls of the ultimate global power. The transmission of these universal truths had triggered a shockwave that crossed the Mediterranean Sea. Because when the Roman governor Pontius Pilate caught wind of a Jewish leader preaching an alternative kingdom, based on Persian doctrines of light conquering darkness, Rome realized this was not just a theological dispute. It was a direct existential threat to the empire itself. We have been deeply conditioned to believe that the crucifixion was purely a religious event, a localized squabble over Jewish theology and broken Sabbath rules. They taught you to look at the cross and see only a story of appeasing an angry creator. But look closer. Calls to look at the massive, ruthless machinery behind the execution. If you want to claim your spiritual sovereignty, you must understand the true nature of the enemy. Rome was not just an ancient political government. It was the original matrix of human control. It was a vast, mechanized counterfeit empire built on a very specific frequency. The frequency of extraction. They did not care what gods you prayed to in your private home, as long as you bowed your knee to Caesar, paid your heavy taxes, and accepted your status as a small, powerless subject. Rome thrived on keeping humanity in a permanent state of physical exhaustion and spiritual amnesia. They needed the masses tired, divided, and terrified. Does that sound familiar to you? Think about the modern corporate hustle you wake up to every morning. The endless bills, and the overwhelming anxiety of merely surviving another month. The system has evolved, but the architecture of the matrix remains exactly the same. When the master returned from the East and began activating the masses, he did not just preach nice moral platitudes. He was distributing weapons-grade spiritual technology. He was telling impoverished, exhausted citizens that the kingdom of heaven was not a distant reward controlled by temple priests or Roman emperors. It was a sovereign domain located entirely within their own living bodies. A domain that no tax collector could audit and no legionnaire could conquer. He was initiating an ideological virus of mass awakening. And the architects of the Matrix took immediate notice. But the Iranian manuscript reveals a hidden layer of ancient geopolitical terror that the Church desperately wanted to erase. The Roman governor Pontius Pilate was not just dealing with a local religious rebel. He recognized the frequency of the enemy. In the secret archives, there are preserved fragments of the actual correspondence between Pilate and Emperor Tiberius, dated around the 28th year of the 1st century. Pilate sent urgent, panicked reports back to Rome. He described a Jewish leader who was preaching doctrines that sounded dangerously, undeniably Persian. He reported that this Nazarene was talking about a kingdom of light conquering darkness, a final judgment where the righteous would inherit the earth, a paradigm where the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Pilate knew exactly what he was hearing, but these were not just local Judean teachings. These were the exact esoteric doctrines of Zarathustra. These were the activation codes of the Zoroastrian high priests. To the Roman war machine, the Persian Empire was the ultimate, terrifying threat. They were mortal enemies, locked in a Cold War that spanned centuries. Decades earlier, massive uprisings fueled by Persian prophecies and Eastern symbolism had cost the Roman Empire dearly in blood, gold, and stability. Now, a charismatic, deeply powerful leader standing in the volatile powder keg of Judea was broadcasting a universal message of liberation, carrying the profound esoteric backing of the Eastern sages. This was the absolute nightmare scenario for Emperor Tiberius. The idea that a spiritual leader had been educated by the very priests who inspired Persian resistance and had now returned to preach about an alternative, unstoppable internal kingdom was unthinkable. It was not a religious movement. To Rome, it was supreme political sedition. It was an awakening that could bridge the cultural gap between the Eastern and Western worlds, uniting the divided masses against their Roman oppressors. They had to shut the transmission down. This is the ultimate truth of the crucifixion. It was not an accident. It was a calculated, desperate, imperial strike to assassinate the truth. Rome colluded with the corrupt local religious leaders because their goals were perfectly aligned. The institutional church wanted to protect its monopoly on God, and the Roman Empire wanted to protect its monopoly on human freedom. Together, they executed the ultimate censorship. And they nailed the physical vessel to the wood because they truly believed that by destroying the body, they could kill the frequency. They thought they could silence the living transmission by publicly humiliating the messenger. I want you to think about your own life right now, beloved. When you finally decide to step out of the matrix of your family's toxic dysfunction, when you stop participating in the exhausting consumerist hustle culture, when you stop bowing to the religious guilt and finally claim your identity as part of the chosen one's destiny, what happens? The system attacks you. Your circle shrinks. Friends walk away. You are labeled crazy, a misfit, a rebel. The matrix will always attempt to crucify what it cannot control. But hear me. Your breaking point is not a tomb. It is a womb. It is the birthplace of your greatest breakthrough. Rome wiped their hands clean. They placed a massive stone over the tomb, stationed armed guards, and declared the spiritual rebellion dead. But they fundamentally misunderstood how the universe operates. They did not realize that graces lift, like wings catching the wind, and that absolute surrender is the ultimate power. They thought the cross was the end of the story. They thought they had buried the light. But his resurrection did not just conquer death. It triggered the exact Zoroastrian prophecies that Rome feared the most. When the news of the empty tomb reached the spiritual communities of the East, it was seen as the undeniable, cosmic proof that the universal Savior had overcome the darkness. So the explosion of light from that tomb forced the Roman Empire into absolute panic mode. The awakening was spreading too fast to be killed by swords. And because they could not stop the movement of the sovereign soul, the empire had to execute their most deceptive, terrifying backup plan. A psychological operation so brilliant and so sinister, it is still keeping billions of people trapped in spiritual amnesia today. When the physical vessel of the Master was destroyed on that wooden cross, the Roman Empire exhaled a collective breath of relief. They had executed the rebel. They had silenced the frequency. Or so they thought. But 3 days later, a cosmic detonation occurred in the unseen realm. The resurrection was not just a biological miracle. It was the ultimate demonstration of spiritual sovereignty. It was the absolute proof that the eternal light cannot be killed by temporal darkness. And when the news of the empty tomb echoed across the ancient trade routes, it did not just reach the local villages of Judea. The shockwave hit the magnificent capital of the Persian Empire. Imagine the scene in Ctesiphon. The Iranian manuscript captures this exact historical moment. When the Supreme Council of the Magi heard that the young master they had trained, the one they had named the bearer of divine light, had conquered death itself, an absolute spiritual fire ignited across the East. They did not view this as the birth of a new Western religion. They viewed it as the ultimate fulfillment of their own 500-year-old Zoroastrian prophecies. The ancient texts predicted that the universal Savior, the Saoshyant, would be rejected by the leaders of his people and delivered to the enemies of truth. But it also explicitly prophesied that death could not hold him because he was life itself. The Persian document preserves a breathtaking letter written by the high priest Kartir, sent to all the esoteric communities scattered throughout the empire. The letter declared, "The young man we knew has conquered death itself, confirming that all our father's prophecies were fulfilled in him." The kingdom approaches. Prepare your hearts for the day of universal renewal. Listen closely to me. The Eastern world was completely activating. A unified consciousness of universal love and spiritual sovereignty was rapidly spreading across borders, cultures, and empires. And this was the exact scenario that kept Roman emperors awake at night in a cold sweat. The movement was growing too vast, too powerful, and too deeply rooted in personal liberation to be stopped by crucifixion. Rome realized that if you cannot execute a movement, you only have one strategic option left. You must hijack it. Enter Emperor Constantine. The religious matrix wants you to believe that Constantine had a miraculous vision of a cross in the sky and suddenly surrendered his life to God. They teach you that the Roman Empire became holy overnight. That is a sanitized institutional lie. Constantine was a brilliant, ruthless military strategist. He did not convert for the salvation of his soul. He converted to execute the greatest political acquisition in human history. The empire was fracturing. He needed a unifying ideology to hold his massive territories together. He saw this unstoppable awakening spreading across his empire and decided to absorb it. But there was a massive problem. The pure, esoteric teachings of the Master, the frequency of the inner temple, the activation of the divine spark, and his deep connections to Persian wisdom were absolutely useless to an emperor. You cannot tax a sovereign soul. You cannot politically control a population that knows how to access the Creator directly through their own breath. Constantine needed a religion of compliance. He needed a hierarchy. He needed a distant God in the sky and a system of rules that required the empire to act as the official middleman. He needed one faith, one emperor, one destiny. In the year 325, he convened the Council of Nicaea. And they tell you this council was a holy gathering of holy men defining the ultimate truth of the Bible. What they do not tell you is who was standing outside the doors. The Iranian manuscript reveals the Great Erasure. According to the ancient records, the representatives of the Eastern churches and the bishops from Syria, Mesopotamia, and Persia, who possessed the direct geographical memories of the Master's Eastern education, were systematically excluded from the main deliberations. The men who held the actual esoteric keys, who knew about his study of sacred mathematics, his mastery of Buddhist compassion, and his initiation in the fire temples, were locked out. Inside those marble walls, the Romanized Western bishops carefully surgically stripped the universal mystic teachings from the narrative. Thus, they gathered the ancient scrolls, the gospel accounts, and the secret codes, and they began the ultimate censorship. Any text that put the spiritual power directly back into your hands was labeled heresy. Any manuscript that detailed his 18 lost years in the East was condemned. They voted on what you were allowed to read. They voted on how you were allowed to pray. They built a theological prison around the most dangerous truth in human history. And then they lit the match. Across the empire, Roman soldiers marched into monasteries, libraries, and hidden sanctuaries. They dragged the forbidden scrolls into the courtyards and burned them. They burned the records of his Persian education. They buried the profound, mystical synthesis he had created. They took a living, breathing, universal transmission of love and transfiguration, and they forged it into an iron cage of religious dogma. This is the exact reason why you feel a profound disconnect when you sit in a modern church service. This is why you have always felt like something massive was missing from the sermons you were forced to listen to. Your soul is not broken. Your spiritual DNA simply recognizes the erasure. You are sensing the void where the ancient spiritual technologies were cut out. You feel the ghost of the burned scrolls. They thought they had won. They thought the great erasure was absolute. They built their massive cathedrals, established their religious industrial complex, and sat on their thrones for 2,000 years, confident that the esoteric truth was forever reduced to ashes. But the architects of the Matrix made one fatal cosmic miscalculation. They forgot that you cannot burn a frequency. and they completely underestimated the awakening of the remnant. Have you always felt like you did not belong here? Like you were dropped into a family, a culture, or a religious system that felt entirely foreign to your exhausted soul? You sat in their crowded congregations. You listened to their rigid rules. You tried to shrink yourself down to fit inside their theological boxes so you would not make them uncomfortable. But no matter how hard you tried, you always felt the heavy friction. You were the black sheep, the outcast, the one asking the deep questions they were too terrified to answer. They called you rebellious. They called you a misfit. They made you feel like you were deeply flawed. But they were absolutely wrong. Listen to me, beloved. You are not crazy. You are not broken. That lifelong friction you have felt deep in your chest is the ultimate proof of your divine blueprint. You feel the itch, the ache, the holy dissatisfaction, because your spiritual DNA immediately recognizes the matrix of control. You carry the exact same ancient frequency that the empire tried to burn 2,000 years ago. Look back at the decades behind you. The marriages that fell apart and left you feeling frozen inside your chest. The careers that drained your life force for a system that does not even know your name. The financial panics that kept you staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m, whispering please until your throat went raw, the sickness that tried to take you out. You have stayed up in the deafening silence wondering if your life was just a series of random cruel events. You wonder if you are running out of time. You wonder if your best years were wasted serving a counterfeit empire. Hear me right now. The Creator wastes nothing. The universe does not make mistakes with sovereign souls. The crushing pressure you survived was never a punishment. It was a rigorous, highly calibrated preparation. The pit is a womb, not a tomb. It looks like a grave, but it is exactly where your true destiny is conceived. You were being forged in the dark so you could hold the monumental light. The young master did not reach his ultimate transfiguration by staying in the safe, comfortable village of his youth. He had to walk through the blazing fire temples of Ctesiphon and the freezing isolation of the eastern mountains. Touching your life, your specific painful, beautiful journey has been your own sacred crucible. You are a cycle breaker. You were sent into your bloodline to dismantle the generational shadows of poverty, anxiety, and religious trauma. You are not merely a weak mortal struggling to survive a hostile planet. You are a masterpiece undergoing rigorous training. For centuries, the religious industrial complex has built massive cathedrals of stone and glass. They designed them to make you feel small, powerless, and entirely dependent on their hierarchy. They told you the kingdom of God was a physical destination you might reach after you die if you paid your dues and obeyed their script. They wanted you asleep. They wanted you suffering from chronic spiritual amnesia. Because an awakened human being is the most dangerous force to a corrupt empire. But the Master brought back a spiritual technology of absolute sovereignty. The kingdom of heaven does not come with external signs. It cannot be contained in a building. It dwells entirely within every single soul that chooses light over darkness. Your physical body is the true and final holy of holies. When you finally realize this, the entire counterfeit empire loses its grip on your mind. You do not need a middleman to access the Creator. You do not need their permission to experience the miraculous. The master key has always been buried right there inside your own chest, waiting, dormant, ready for the grand awakening. The Master showed us that the remedy for human suffering is not to flee the world, but to transform it by bringing the eternal into time. You have sovereign power over your reality right now. You can access infinite creative force right now. When fear rises, when the gossip tries to strangle your confidence, When the medical empire tries to label you as broken, you must remember who you are. You are the revelation. You are the return. The empire burned the ancient parchment scrolls, but they could never burn the frequency, because the frequency was always meant to be hidden inside of you. I want you to do something sacred with me right now. We are going to break the illusion of separation. Wherever you are listening to this, close your eyes. Place your hand firmly over your heart. Feel that steady, faithful beating beneath your ribs. That is not just biology. That is the rhythm of creation pulsing through your living temple. Take a deep, slow breath in. Pull the frequency of heaven directly into your physical body. Feel the warmth, tingling, and pressure of your own divine spark igniting. Now whisper these words with me. I am a sovereign soul. I carry the eternal light. I am breaking the chains. It is done. Not a metaphor, not a myth. Real. When you speak it, you anchor it into your reality. You make it undeniable. If you felt that profound shift in your spirit today, do not let the matrix pull you back to sleep. You are part of the hidden remnant, and it is time to take your rightful place. Subscribe to The Chosen One's Destiny as your sacred vow of remembrance. This is not just a channel. It is a private sanctuary for the awakened ones who refuse to stay small. Like this video as a digital signal fire telling the machines and the unseen realm that the light still burns and we are gathering our scattered tribe. Now share this living transmission with someone who is standing at their own breaking point right now. Be the lifeline they are desperately praying for. Walk in that light, beloved. Let it guide you. Let it transform the mundane reality around you into a walking Eden. You were always meant to find your way here. Welcome home. The flame has been lit inside you. Let it spread. Join us next time on The Chosen One's Destiny as we decode the final forbidden prophecies of the Watchers and reveal the terrifying truth about the entities that have been manipulating human history from the shadows. Until then, stay watchful, stay grounded, and stay unshakably His.